So to get into the develop module, there's two different ways you can do it. So the first way is to go up here, expand this top panel, and click on develop. And when you do that, it's going to go and open up the develop module with the first image that was selected. But another way you can do it, let's jump back to the library. And if you don't remember anything else from here as far as shortcuts go, please remember these two. If you remember G for grid and D for develop, those are two that you'll switch back and forth between all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse this top panel, and I'm going to select this image and hit D, and we are in the develop module. Now let's go ahead and go over what we're looking at here. So starting at the top, this panel is the exact same as we had in the library, so I'm going to go ahead and keep it hidden. And the same thing on the bottom, if I expand that, it's only showing me the images that are in the quick collection right now, as you can see right here. So I'm going to close that, and we're just going to focus on the two side panels. So starting off on the left-hand side here, we have presets, and this is the exact same thing. If you remember, if I hop back to the grid, you'll see these presets up here are the exact same ones that I have over in the develop module on the left-hand side here. So if you didn't apply them in the grid, you can go ahead and apply them individually to each image here. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse this submodule, and you can see here we have a few others. I'll quickly cover snapshots. There's nothing here. I will explain that in just a little bit, but that's basically a way to save a version of your image. And here we have history. You can see a few things have been done to this image, and a lot more will pop up once I start editing the image. But one of the things that makes Lightroom really powerful is the ability to see what you've done to an image and then go back and undo those changes. So if I wanted to, after a few changes have been made to the image, I can go over here and look at the history, and if I didn't like something, I can just go and revert back to a previous state. So that's something that really sets Lightroom apart from some other applications out there, is you have this ability to view the history of what you've done to an image, undo it, and the other thing is that history stays with the image as long as you have it in the database. So as long as you have an image in your catalog, you can always pull up this history and see what's been done to it. Now right below history we have collections, and this is going to be the exact same thing that we have back here in the grid. So just to jump back, you can see collections. We don't have any collections here, and the same in the develop module, we don't have any, but any that we did have would show up here. So I'm just going to collapse that as well. So let's go ahead and hop on over here to the right hand side, and we start out on the top with a histogram. And once again, it's the exact same thing as we had in the grid. It's in the exact same place and has the exact same information. So I don't really need to cover that, but there is one significant difference here. You'll see there's these two triangles on the upper left and upper right hand side, and what these show are clipping information. So basically what that means, if I hover on this and even click on it, then you'll see these areas that are highlighted in blue on the image. And what those represent are potential areas of information loss. So what the Lightroom is telling me right now is there might be areas in this image where there's no data. There's just black for the shadows. And that's something that might be able to be recovered, and it might not. Now, one thing to note with shadows, when you try and recover heavy shadow detail where it's a really dark image and you try and recover a lot of that and make it brighter, you're possibly going to be introducing a lot of noise into the image. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you have a severely underexposed image, you'll probably introduce noise into it if you try and recover too much information. Now, the same thing goes for, I'm going to click this and turn it off. The same thing goes for highlights. If I go back to the grid and select an image that's very overexposed and go back into develop, you'll see over here the highlight information. There's a lot of information that I'm potentially losing. And if I go ahead and click on this, then you can see in here, if I wanted to zoom in, I could see any information or any of the areas here that are potentially losing information. So I'm going to zoom back out and turn that off, and we'll go over a little bit more and see if we can recover some of this information with some of these other sliders in here. But that's basically the histogram. There's one other feature that is visible here that is not visible in the grid view. Now, if you'll notice, this area below the histogram here changes from this exposure information to whichever section I have highlighted. So right now it's highlights, whites, and you can also see as I change sections in the histogram here, these corresponding sections are changed and are highlighted down here in these sliders as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on this highlights, and I'm just going to drag to the left, and you'll notice there's more detail coming into the sky. So there's more information and detail visible in these clouds here, and the corresponding slider down here, this highlight slider, is now all the way to -100. And so what I just did is I adjusted the highlights in this image. Now the histogram is a really good tool to judge if you should spend a lot of time working on an image or not, because if it's pushed all the way to one side or the other, then that probably means you have some information loss. And in this image, for example, there is probably some information loss in the sky that I will just not be able to recover. So when I see this histogram pushed all the way to the right-hand side, it's probably something that I'm gonna just say, look, it's not worth it. There's not going to be enough information here to make this a complete image. Let's just choose another one and not waste any time editing this particular image. So pay attention to your histogram. It's a very powerful tool that not only shows you the overall exposure of the image, but if you should even spend time working on it or not. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a different image. Let's go back into the grid and let's just start working on this guy here. So I'm going to press D on this image and go ahead and develop it. So when we look over here, you'll see there's some information here. There's some tools, and we're going to hold off on describing those for just a little bit. They're a little more advanced, and so we're just going to start with this basic submodule here. So you can see we start out with treatment. There's color and black and white, and this is basically, do you want to see the image in color? Which does nothing if I click on it because it's already in color, or if I click on black and white, it does a quick conversion to black and white. So this is, if you like black and white images, this is a great way to quickly see what your image is going to look like in black and white versus color. Now I'm going to change it back to color because I like this one better in color. Next we have the white balance, and what white balance is, if you remember from our level 1 photography basics course, light has what is called a color temperature, and that can range anywhere from orange all the way to blue. Now our cameras, if you set them to auto white balance, should compensate for any difference in that color temperature. And so if you have a very orange light shining on your subject, your camera's auto white balance should correct it so it looks like normal light, but it doesn't always do that. Our cameras sometimes miss. So when we go in here to Lightroom, we can correct any differences in color temperature using the white balance tool. So let's go ahead and jump in here and see what we can do for the white balance of this photo. Now, just like in the Quick Develop module, we have this drop-down little menu here, and it has the same exact options. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go ahead and pick Auto and see how that looks, because it was just a normal day outside. That doesn't really look too bad. But just to see what else we can do, I'm gonna go ahead and change this back to As Shot and use a few of these other tools. Now here we have this eyedropper tool, and what that does is you can take it and put it on a neutral target in your image. So a neutral color that's either white or gray or something like that. And what Lightroom is going to do is it's going to say, okay, so if this is supposed to be a neutral target and it sees it's actually really, really orange, then it says, okay, the white balance needs adjusted to this so that the light in the image looks normal. So that's what we're doing when we use this eyedropper. You'll see it says, pick a neutral target. And I'm gonna go down to this white on his armband, and let's see what happens here. So if I click on it, that actually looks a little bit too green to me. So I don't really like the way this looks. I wanna set it back to how it was. Unfortunately, there's not an easy undo. I could go up here and I could go back to As Shot, but I could also go over here to the history. Now you can see in the history here, we do have all of the changes I've made to the image so far. So what I want to do is I want to revert back to this previous step. And if you look up here in the navigator, when I cycle through these different history steps, you can see the image actually changes to whatever I did to it in that particular step. So let's go ahead and choose this As Shot and move back over here to the white balance and use these sliders. So with these sliders, I can adjust the temperature of the color and also the tint of the color. So let's start with temperature, and you see it ranges from blue to yellow. So I can just click on this and drag it from one side to the other, and you can see how drastically that changes the look of the image, and that's purely through color temperature. That has nothing to do with adding color to the image. That's just changing basically the color of the light in the image. So if I drag this a little bit, I can let's see, I can make it look, that looks pretty good to me. So the color temperature might have changed just a little bit. I can do the same thing with tint. If I want to drag it from one side to the other, I can go from green over to magenta, and honestly, it looked pretty good the way it was, but I don't remember where that was. So if you ever make some changes to an image, any of these sliders, what you can do if you don't remember the starting point, well, obviously you can go back over here and you can undo what you just did in the history. But you can also go over and click on the word. So where it says tint here, if I double click, it's going to return the slider to the original location, which is really, really good. So you can feel free, make all the adjustments you want, move these sliders around a lot. And if you ever mess something up, if something doesn't look right, if you can't figure out what you did in history, just go double click on sliders. Everything's going to get reset back to its default value. So let's go ahead and let's call that good for white balance and move on down here to the tone panel. So here in the tone section, we have this auto option just like we did in the grid view. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and you can see it drastically changed the image, but you can also see that it changed all of these sliders down below it. Now, when we were in the grid view, you couldn't see what it actually did. It just magically changed the image. If we had jumped over to the develop module, you would have seen all these sliders had been moved, but in grid, you didn't actually know what it did to the image. So here we can see it increased the exposure and the contrast, it increased the whites and decreased the blacks. But also notice it only affected this particular section here. It didn't affect anything down here or up here or any of these other ones down here that we haven't even looked at yet. It only affects these particular fields. Now I prefer to do all these changes myself. I don't like to let Lightroom make these decisions for me, so I'm going to undo that. Unfortunately, I can't uncheck auto. It's basically fixed once you click on that. So my only option here is to use this history, revert back to the last step. The other thing I could do is use a keyboard shortcut and hit Command Z, and that undoes auto tone. Now the one thing about that is you'll notice it completely disappears from the history here. Whereas if I click auto tone, and then I go click on the previous step, it stays in the history so I could go back to it if I wanted to. So let's go ahead and move down this list here and talk about these different sliders. So let's start with exposure. Now, as you know, exposure is made up of 3 different variables. There's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and they're all measured in stops. And if you increase the exposure by 1 stop, it makes an image brighter. If you decrease exposure by a stop, it makes an image darker. It's the exact same principle here in Lightroom. So if I go into this exposure slider, I can click on this here and drag it one way or the other. And if I drag it to the left, it makes the image darker. If I drag it to the right, it makes the image brighter. So I'm going to go ahead and drag it down here. And right now I have the exposure increased by 1 stop. I could just as easily click in here and let's expose by +2 stops. That looks like too much, so I'm going to go ahead and change this back to 1 stop, and I think that looks pretty good. Now, if I go back to the other example here, okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this image and see if we can recover any more of this sky detail. So remember earlier, we did adjust the highlights all the way down using the histogram, which revealed some clouds. Now, another thing that I could have done in this histogram is looked at the right side here, and you can see this solid line on the far right side of the histogram. Anytime you see something like that, it typically means you have lost information because it's pushed so far, it just spiked all the way up. That means there's a lot of white in this image, and that typically means we have lost information. Another thing you can do, keep your eyes on this section below the histogram. When I move over into the image, you'll see it has these percentages and they're RGB. So those are the different color channels, and you'll see they're exactly the same. They're right now 98.8%, which is basically pure white. What that means is all this information is gone. There is no difference in the channels. If I move down in here, they're all going to be different. No matter where I go in the image, the 3 color channels have different values. So when you see 3 numbers that are the same, that most likely or pretty much always means you have lost information. But let's go ahead and try and reduce the exposure by a little over 2 stops. You can see the sky looks a whole lot better now. But here in the blown out part, we have no information. Those numbers are still exactly the same under the histogram, and this is basically just an off-white, but it's still just white. There's nothing there. So unfortunately for this image, there's nothing we can do even if we reduce the exposure all the way. No clouds. This is pretty much an image that we can't do anything with. So let's go ahead and jump back to our original image that we were working on and move further down the list and talk about contrast next. So next we come to contrast, and what is it? Well, contrast is the difference in light and color in parts of an image. So you might have seen an image that is just kind of blah. There's not a lot of pop to it, and we refer to that typically as a flat image. Well, the reason for that is the lights and the brights aren't really bright and the darks aren't really dark. Everything is just kind of pushed towards the middle. So in Lightroom, you can actually use the contrast slider to adjust that and make your image pop just a little bit more. But be careful because a little bit goes a long way. This is not normally something you want to drastically increase, and I'll show you why. So in here, if we go to this contrast slider, I'm just going to click it and drag it around so you can see what happens. So if we drag it up and increase the contrast quite a bit, you can see he's not looking so good, and you can see it did affect the color as well as the light and the dark areas of the image. So let's go ahead and decrease that and see what happens. And here everything just kind of blends to blah. It's not an attractive image anymore. It's all just kind of bland. So you can see what contrast does to an image. I'm going to double click this to bring it back to normal. And let's just say maybe like 10 here and see what happens. So that didn't really do much, but let's switch back and forth here. And you can see it did just, it added a little bit of pop to these darks, a little bit of pop to the lights. So I'm just going to leave that where it is. So moving down, let's take a look at these next four, starting with highlights. Now you can probably guess what the next two sliders do. They affect the highlights and the shadows of the image, but they're very, very powerful sliders, and you'll actually find that you use them a lot. So let me demonstrate exactly how they work. So in here, if you hover over this highlight slider and look at the histogram, you can see the part that's gray. And right now there's not a lot of information that's being affected. It's really just this little section in here. And so that means we don't have a lot of highlight information. With the shadows, we do have a lot more data. There's quite a bit of shadow information. So let's just click on these sliders and see what happens. So if I slide this highlight slider to the right, the highlights get brighter. So you can see behind his head that bright area does get brighter. If I pull it to the left, it gets darker. And I'm just going to reset that. And let's see what happens with the shadows. If I click on it and pull it to the right, the shadows get brighter. So you can see his hat is drastically changing and the bushes are getting a lot brighter, or not necessarily brighter, but less dark. And if I pull it to the left, then they do definitely get darker. So this is something you can use to affect certain parts of your image. In this one, I actually like the way everything looks, but I'm going to switch over to a different image and show you just how powerful these sliders can be. Now let's go ahead and jump into this image, which is a great candidate for showing off these highlight and shadow sliders because it does have quite a bit of highlights and shadows. Now if it looks familiar, that's because it is. This is the exact same composition and scene as the image that we lost all the information here. This is just a better exposure. So hopefully we'll be able to recover more information in the sky with this highlight slider, and then we'll play with the shadows a little and see what happens. Now one thing I do want to point out, look at the histogram up here. It's not pushed all the way over to the right like the previous image was that was this similar scene. This one actually has a nice fall off here, which means we're not losing any of this highlight or white information. Another thing to look at is these numbers, the percentages under the histogram here. When I scroll throughout the sky, they are different. They are not all exactly the same like they were in the previous image, which means we have information in all of these areas. Now, it does look like we have some highlights that are clipping here, and you can see those highlighted in red here, but I'm really not too concerned about that because the majority of the sky is there, and once we start messing with the highlights, we might be able to recover that as well. So let's go down here and pull this slider over to the left and see what happens. And you can see we have so much color, so much detail coming back into this sky. It looks so much better than it did before. So I've got the highlights all the way at -100. We no longer have any clipping going on in the sky here, and obviously we have information in pretty much the entire area here. So if on the other hand, if I take the highlights and slide it over to the right, you can see the sky turns bright white. We lose a ton of information. We have a lot of clipping going on here, and this is not a good setting. So we want the highlights more to the left where we are recovering information in the sky. Now, one really powerful tool in Lightroom is you can actually see this clipping just like you do up here while you adjust these sliders. So if you hold down the Alt or the Option key while you click this slider, then it's going to show you any information that's getting lost. So right now, everything is black. We have no highlight information getting lost, but look at that. Once we get here right to the default, basically to 0, we have shadow or highlight information being lost. And as I move it farther to the right, we lose more and more and end up with an image looking like this. So that's a great tool that will let you see exactly what you're doing. So I'm going to click the highlights back down, and let's move on down to the shadows. Now with the shadows, same thing. If I move to the left, everything gets darker. And if I move to the right, everything gets lighter. And this actually makes the image look a lot better. If you look at the shadow section of the histogram, there is a lot of information. Actually, most of the image is probably shadow information. So when I move this to the right, it brightens up the majority of the image. Now I don't want to do this too much. And again, if I hold down Option, I can see there I'm starting to lose some shadow information the darker I make it, but that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and keep this probably right around here. Looks all right for me. Now, one thing to be careful about when you're adjusting the highlight and shadow sliders, you can start to make the image look a little flat. So even though it looks a lot better than it did before, it does look a little flat to me, and we could either go in and we could use this contrast slider to add some contrast to the scene, which in a landscape, it doesn't look too bad, but there's another, and in my opinion, better way to adjust the overall look and pop of the image, and that is by using these next two sliders, whites and blacks. So I'm going to go ahead and reset contrast, and let's use these next two sliders. Now before we jump into these, I do want to point out one more thing. We have made some drastic changes to this image, and just so you can appreciate what we've done, I want to show you what it looked like when we started. So there's two ways we can do that. We can go over here to history and go all the way to the bottom and click on import, and that brings it back to the way it looked when we imported it into our computer before any changes were made. But there's a much easier way to do that. On your keyboard, if you press the backslash key, that reverts between the original image and your currently modified image. And it's a really good way to quickly switch before and after and see how much you've changed your image. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's a really nice keyboard shortcut that you can use to see what exactly you've done to your image. So let's go in here and just slide these whites and blacks around and see what happens. It should be pretty obvious. These white and black sections of the image are going to be affected. So let's just click on whites and see what happens. If we drag it to the left, well, that doesn't really seem to do too much. It might make it look a little more flat, especially in the sky. But let's drag it to the right and see what happens. And it really makes everything brighter. It actually makes that sky glow, makes it look like a really bright sunset. And so that's a really nice way to add some pop to these lighter areas of your image. Now, one thing to note is that if you look at the histogram, I have actually lost information in the sky here. And I could have also seen that if I held down the Alt or the Option key while I slid this white slider, I can see that information is getting lost here. Now, the preferred way to do this is to slide this until I just barely start to lose information and then stop. And that's gonna give me basically the ideal balance between increased white levels and the loss of information and keeping that to a minimum. So personally, I might raise this up just a tiny bit more because I'm okay losing this little bit of detail here where the sun is bursting through the clouds. There's really not a lot to see there, and it kind of adds to the overall impact. So let's go ahead and do the same thing with blacks. Now with the blacks, it's going to affect the overall image, but specifically the darker areas. So let's go ahead and just click on this and see what happens. So if I drag to the left, you can see everything gets darker, a lot more poppy here, and it doesn't really look too bad, but it is pretty dark. If I drag to the right, everything starts to look kind of blah and bland, and I don't like that at all. So let's drag this down, and while I do this, I'm going to hold the Alt or the Option key and see where I start to lose some shadow detail. So if I go all the way to the left, you see I lose a lot of information here. And so we're going to bring this clipping back up so I just start to lose some information, and let's see how that looks. That looks okay. I might drop that down just a little more. I'm using the arrow key, and that's another shortcut you can do. While you hover over this and this little box over here is highlighted, you can use the up and down arrows to adjust the levels as well. So let's go ahead and go with that. You can see here we are hardly losing any information, so I think this looks pretty good. So think about what we've just done. We've pushed the whites as far as we can go without losing information, and we've pushed the blacks as far as we can go without losing information. So essentially, we've made the brights bright and the darks dark without losing a lot of data. And that, in effect, increases the overall contrast of the image. So I want you to take a quick look here and see how it looked before we made those adjustments. So in this history panel, I'm going to go down below where we stopped with the shadows and click on that. And you can see there is a significant difference in both the sky and the land. And you can see the final image that we have here has a lot more pop. There's a lot more contrast between the brights in the sky and the darks in these rocks. And overall, the image is just a lot more appealing. And we've done that all using only 4 sliders: highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Next, we move to the present section. Now, you want to be careful when you use these sliders. They should definitely be used in moderation, especially if you're not really sure what they do. So let's start off and talk about clarity. With clarity, it basically affects the mid-tone contrast in the image. And I'm going to jump in here and demonstrate what that looks like. So if we take this clarity slider and we slide it all the way up to +100, you can see it drastically affects the way the image looks. There's a lot more, almost looks like more detail here in the foreground and in the sky. And if I zoom in on these hills and mountains in the back, you can actually see a big telltale sign of increased and too much clarity, which is kind of this halo across this ridge here. And basically, this happens when you add too much clarity to an image. You get this kind of white halo across these lines here, and that's not really something that you want in your images. You'll actually see this quite a bit on Instagram, online. You'll see people who do use too much clarity, and that is a sure way to pick it out. You'll be able to see it from now on. So what I want to do, I definitely don't want to use a lot of clarity, but let's jump all the way to the other side and other extreme and see what this looks like. And you can see now so much of the detail in this image is gone. It looks very flat and very soft and fuzzy, almost like someone put Vaseline on the lens. It looks almost smeary. So we definitely don't want that either. So let's take our clarity and jump up to a more moderate number. Now, we don't recommend going any higher than 20 or so, and even that can be too much. It's possibly okay for landscape images if you're not getting those halos around hard edges. But for people, 20 is generally going to be way too much because it accentuates different features like pores and hairs and wrinkles, and it really is not flattering unless you want a very harsh, severe look for the people in your images. You might even consider using negative clarity, maybe -5 or so, and that can actually have a bit of a softening effect on people's skin. But for this image, let's just go ahead and say +10 and call it good, because that is going to give us just a little bit more mid-tone contrast here without overdoing it too much. Next, we have vibrance and saturation, and I want to start off with saturation. So what it does is it basically affects all of the colors in an image, and if you decrease it too much, you'll end up with a black and white image, and if you increase it too much, you'll just get this crazy boost in all of the colors, and it just looks really bad. So let me demonstrate that for you really quickly. So if I go down here to the saturation slider, and I go all the way to the left and decrease it 100%, all of the color goes away and I end up with a black and white photograph. So that's not a good way to do black and white photographs. There's a lot better ways out there. So as far as going too negative on the saturation, it's something you really don't ever want to do. Now let's go all the way to the plus side, and that really looks horrible. That looks kind of like I threw up on the screen, and I just don't like that a bit. So with saturation, you have to be very, very careful. Maybe, somewhere around here might be okay. You can see the colors in the sand here look pretty good, but it's something that can get out of control really quickly. So instead of using saturation, let's reset that and let's talk about vibrance. Now, vibrance, on the other hand, is a lot different than saturation. Whereas saturation affects all of the colors in an image equally, vibrance doesn't do the same. Now, if you have already saturated colors in an image, vibrance tries to leave those alone, and instead it's going to affect the more muted colors and try and increase the intensity of those to make them just look a little better. So let's go ahead and dive in here and see how that looks. So I'm going to go ahead and take this vibrance and let's drop it all the way down like we did with the saturation. And you can see it doesn't turn it into a black and white image. We still have some subtle colors in the sky. There's some orange and blue. This foreground still looks a little red, but really most of the color's gone. Not really something you'd want to do. So let's jump all the way to the other extreme and go to +100. Now this doesn't look nearly as bad as the saturation did. It's still not something I would do to my final image, but it's something that at least looks somewhat realistic. If we drop it down to maybe 50 or so, that actually looks really good. And there's a good amount of color in the foreground. There's some color in the sky here, but it doesn't look unreal. It doesn't look overdone. And this is something that I could actually see using in my final image. Now, I'm not gonna go this crazy. I'm gonna drop it down to maybe say, let's do plus 25 and see how that looks. And the reason for that is as I move further down in the editing process, these colors are going to be affected by other different submodules here. So I don't want to go too crazy yet. If you were going to stop right here and not use anything else down here, something like 50 might work just fine. But we're going to stick with 25 and see what happens. So before we get too much farther down this list and start talking about tone curve and these more advanced editing options, I want to jump back up and talk about these tools that we initially skipped. So let's go ahead and select a different image to work on. So I'm going to go back into the grid here and let's just use this one. So in Develop, you have these different tool options across here, and I'm just going to select the first one, which is the Crop and Straighten tool. Now, if you know your image needs cropped or straightened, you might start here before you ever do any other editing to it. So let's go ahead and see what our options are here. So before you do any cropping, you should always adjust the angle and straighten it out. So we have a tool here which says angle, and if I click on that and drag it, you can see it changes the tilt of the image and adjusts the angle to straighten out any lines that should be straight. So I want to go ahead and make that go back to straight and show you a different way. Another way I can do it is if I hover up here, you can see I get this little two-sided arrow, and I can click on this corner and it's a little more subtle. It's a little more of a gradual adjustment. And so I can do this. And the really helpful thing is when I am using that tool, I get these lines, this grid across the image that help me see straight lines. And so any of these lines that are in here, like these up here, or this line going across here, I can use those as a reference for straightening this image. And that actually looks pretty straight to me. Now, another thing that I can do is I can use this level tool. So if I click on this, it's actually a straighten tool. And I want to say, from this point to this point should be a straight line. So if I click here and hold down and drag across to here and then let go, if I've done a good job, then that should be straight. So let's go ahead and take a look. Looking at that grid, it actually looks a little bit off, so I'm going to undo that and just use my previous straightening here. Now the next thing I want to do is crop this image and maybe get rid of a little bit of this empty space around here, just so that she is a little more the center of attention. So the way I do that is I can go up here and I can click on either this corner, you can see there's like a little handle here, or in the middle, and I have them on all four sides and all four corners. And if I click on that, then what it's going to do is it's going to change the corners, this intersection, so this side and this side, I'm going to pull them in towards my subject here. And I can do the same thing on the top here, and what it's going to do is it's going to pull the left and the right sides and the top in towards my subject. So that's an easy way to quickly adjust the composition of my image. Another thing I can do is I can click on the photo and I can drag it around if I have the basic size of the crop, but I want to change the orientation or the positioning of my subject within the image. Now, one thing that you do want to check is this lock over here. If it's locked, then when I drag on these corners and adjust the crop of the image, my aspect ratio doesn't change. But watch what happens if I unlock it. If I do that and I drag on the top, then suddenly the sides don't pull in anymore and the top is only going to go down. So I'm drastically changing the aspect ratio of this image, and you can see now we have a custom aspect ratio. So if I click on this, you can see it's custom, and I could change to any of these different aspect ratios. So what I want to do, I want to go back to the as shot, and unfortunately that resets my crop, but that's not a big deal. I can just pull it in quickly. I can drag her around in here a little bit, and I have my final image. So another thing that you can do is, let's say I wanted to change this from a horizontal image to a vertical. If I click on this tool over here next to the aspect ratio and pull it in here, I can just manually crop, and you can see by default it's going to go sideways and do a horizontal crop. But if I pull down, then it's going to change to a vertical crop. and I can change it to a bit more of a portrait. I really don't like that, so I'm gonna just undo that and go back to this crop, and we're gonna call it good. We're gonna say that this is the final crop that we want for this image. Now to apply this, you can go ahead and just press close here, and we get the crop, or I could have also, while I'm in here, just pressed enter, and we get the same thing that happens. So now you can see the before and after, before I started cropping this image. You can see there's a lot more focus on her, and it's a lot more engaging of an image. Now the next tool over is the spot healing tool. So if I click on that, you'll see I have a brush, and the first options you have here are clone or heal. Now personally, I pretty much always leave it on heal because that kind of uses a little more of Lightroom's capabilities at healing an area and blending the edges together, whereas clone is simply going to take one section and stamp it right into another. So let's go ahead and see how this works. If I'm in here and I want to zoom in on the image, if I press the spacebar, nothing happens. I end up with this magnifying glass, so I have to hold down the spacebar and click on the image, and now I get zoomed in. Now, I see my brush moving around here, and I have a few different options for the brush. I can increase or decrease the size with this, and if you see it over to the left there, you can see it getting bigger and smaller. I can also add some feathering to it, so you'll be able to see if I make it bigger. You can see this edge that's around the inside brush, and that's basically the feathering edge. So if I increase that, you can see that grows a lot larger, even though the brush size hasn't drastically changed or really changed at all. If I decrease the feather down to 0, it's just one hard edge and a solid brush. And finally, I can change the opacity, so basically changing or adjusting the effect that it has on the final image here. So let's go ahead and keep opacity up at 100. Let's keep feather around, let's say maybe 26 or so. And let's drop the size down to around 20. And that's gonna allow me to go in here and clean up a few of these little blemishes. Now I'm not gonna do a lot, but just to show you kind of what it can do, I can go in here and say, click on this area. And what it does is it samples an area around it that you can see is this circle here, and it heals the area that I clicked on. So if I go ahead and hide the brush, you can see that that blemish went away. And another quick way to see that is you see this little black and white checkbox here. If I click that, it turns off spot removal. So you can see those spots come right back when I turn it off. When I click it, turn it back on, you can see they disappear. So that's a good way to see what effect this tool is having. So I'm gonna go ahead and use this on another couple of blemishes here. And if you don't wanna use this slider, personally, I never use it. There are other ways to adjust the brush size. So you can use the brackets on the keyboard, which are the open and close brackets, and those increase the brush size. Or if you have a trackpad like I have here on this iMac, if you use your 2 fingers and slide up and down, that's gonna increase or decrease the brush size as well. And that's personally the method I always use on my MacBook. It's just super easy to do. So I can click that, I can go over here. I'm gonna use the keys this time, and let's go ahead and get rid of that blemish. And maybe this one here, let's make it a bit smaller, or about there. So let's go ahead and take a look. You can see before the spot removal and after, as I click back and forth, take a look at her face, and you can see those little spots appear and disappear. So you can see that this tool is not too bad at doing that. Now in newer versions of Lightroom, Adobe has actually incorporated the ability to not just heal spots and small blemishes, but longer, not round areas as well. So you can use this spot healing brush and drag it across an image and heal something that is not just a small round shape. So I'm gonna show you how to do this here. And what I wanna do is let's go ahead and remove this little piece of hair on her forehead. So to do that, I'm gonna go back into the brush tool, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in to a 3:1 view here, just to make it a little bit easier. So if I go up here, I think that's a pretty good brush size, and I just click and I drag across that hair. Then when I let go, what it does, it selects an area that it thinks will heal it just fine. And if I turn off this brush, you can see that actually looks pretty good. Now, the one thing that I will say is this is not a tool that you want to use for extensive retouching. If she had a bunch of hairs all over her head, this would get really slow, it would get bogged down, and it's just really not that capable of a tool. It's not intended for extensive retouching of flyaways or things like that. So just make sure that this is a tool that you can use for simple retouching, something like one hair, a couple blemishes, but it's not something you want to go crazy with and do 100 different spots on an image. Now the next tool you hopefully won't have a lot of use for because it's the red eye reduction tool. So I don't have an image with red eye to demonstrate on, but let me just go ahead and jump in here and we will show you how it works and what it looks like on this guy. So I'm gonna zoom into his eyes and whoa, that's the 3:1. So let's go back to 1:1 and click on this red eye tool here. And you can see it also can correct pet eye. So if you have this crazy glowing eyes on your cats or your dogs, that will fix that. So that might be a little more common, but let's just do the red eye. So let's go ahead and drag this over here and see if we can get this to work. So it might have a tough time because it can't see his pupil or anything and he doesn't have red eye, but let's just click on the center of his eye and see what happens. Well, that didn't really work very well. Let's try it again in a little different place. And there we go. So that kind of like focused in on where his eyeball is. It's going to work a lot better on someone who actually does have red eye and you can see everything. But you can see it's a pretty simple tool. You can go up here and make a few adjustments to the pupil size. You can adjust how much it should darken it. And there you can see if that center in there was red, you would be able to darken it quite a bit and make it look a little bit more normal. So like I said, hopefully you don't have a lot of reason to use this, but if you do, at least you know it's here. So let's move on over to the graduated filter, which I think is a wonderful tool. All right, so we're just gonna edit this image. Let's go ahead and go into the develop module and into the graduated filter. Now what we've got here is we have a lot of different presets that we can use. So if I click on one of these up top here, it's just gonna simply adjust these sliders just one at a time. Whereas if I choose one down here like burn highlights, we have multiple sliders that are affected, both the exposure and the highlights are affected. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of these graduated filters and see how they work. So if I drag it just a little bit here, then you can see that the top part of this image is getting a lot darker and it's gradually falling off towards nothing here. And if I go ahead and click here and drag this down a bit further, you can see more of the sky is getting affected. And really what's happening, this first box here is getting fully affected and then here it's gradually falling off until down below, nothing is getting affected. And we can show what this looks like by clicking this mask overlay. So you can see here, there's this pink part and then you can see it gradually fades out to nothing down here. And I can also turn that off and on just by pressing the O button on my keyboard. So if you want to see exactly what you're affecting, you can turn that on. And I normally have it turned off because I can see the effect well enough up here. So if I wanted to make that a little bit bigger, I could drag it down. I can also click on this middle here. You see I turn to arrows and I can adjust the angle here if I wanted to. And if I wanted to just move this in general, I can click on this and I can, do anything. I can move it down here. But keep in mind, everything from the top down is being affected, so I don't really want it down here. This is going to be a much better place. One last thing, if I want this just to come out straight when I drag it, so let's go ahead and delete this and create a new one. If I hold down the shift key when I drag it, then it's going to come straight. No matter what I do moving side to side here, it stays parallel to the top of the image. So that's really nice if you have straight lines and you don't want to angle this too much. So if I wanted to adjust the intensity of this a bit, I could go ahead and go over here and move these sliders. I could change this exposure and you can see how much more drastic that affects the top part than the bottom part. And I could also adjust the highlights, but I don't really want to do anything quite that crazy. So I'm just going to go over here to my history and undo both of those. And we're just gonna say that's good. We're not trying to really edit this image. I just kind of want to give you an idea of how these things work. So if I call that good, if I hit enter, then that sets that and I can go ahead and create a new one. So let's say I want this bottom part here to be just a little lighter. Maybe it's a little bit too dark. So I can go in here and let's just say we want to dodge it some. So I can drag one here from the corner and kind of drag it up like that. And you can see instead of drastically affecting this part of the image, it's a gradual fall off here. So if I hit enter, then it's set there. And if I want to go ahead and go back and work on it some more, I can click on this and we can say make it darker if we wanted to make it really dramatic. But let's go ahead and just make it a little bit lighter like that. Now you'll notice another thing, when I hovered over this, the overlay popped up. So if you don't want to click on here and view the overlays, if you just hover over this dot in the center here, then that makes it pop up as well. So if I hit enter, then we'll go ahead and set that. And I can do that as many times as I want with as many of these different settings as I want. So I want to add one more filter in here, and I want to go ahead and make this part of the sky a little bit darker like this. So what I'm going to do is create a filter, and I don't have to use these presets here. I can just manually move these sliders to where I want them. So let's go ahead and use that, and we will underexpose the sky a little bit here, drag that into there, and that looks pretty good. Let's add just a little bit of color so that it looks a little bit better, and that's looking pretty good there. So the one thing I do want to do is I don't want these mountains to be tinted blue and darkened. And if I turn on this mask, I can see that this filter is definitely touching the mountains. So what I can do is go to the brush tool here, and we'll talk about the brush tool a little bit more in just a minute here. But for now, what I do want to point out is there is an erase option, and if I turn on auto mask, then as I erase over these mountains, you'll see this mask, this red part, starting to go away. So we're removing this filter from the mountains so they're not affected by this darkening and this blue effect. And what the auto mask does is it basically keeps it inside the mountains, and so we don't lose a lot of our filter's effect up here in the sky. It made a nice even line here where the brush ran along the top of the mountains, and it kept all of the effect in the sky. So if I go ahead and turn off this overlay, you can see now our sky over here looks a lot better, pretty close to this, but our mountains have stayed bright, they aren't blue, and it's looking a lot better than it did before. So that's a pretty good overview of the graduated filter. You can see it's a really powerful tool. You can use it for a lot of different things, and I personally use it quite a bit, even for my wedding and my portrait work. It's not just limited to landscapes. So let's go ahead and move to the next tool here, which is the radial filter, and I'm gonna choose a different image to use for this. So let's go ahead and go back to this guy here, and I wanna show you how this works and what it does. So when we open it up, you see a lot of these same sliders that we've seen before. Nothing new here, even the same effects and presets, those are all exactly the same. But the way this tool works is pretty unique. So let's say I want to make this guy stand out and darken up the background some. Now I could do that. I could drop in graduated filters from each side here and darken up these corners, but I want to use a different tool here. So let's keep this exposure at minus 0.68. I'm going to click in the center of where I want this filter to be, and if I drag up and out, you can see what's happening here. It's basically creating this round filter, and everything on the outside of it is getting darkened, and then gradually on the inside it's getting lightened. And it's really obvious if I turn on the mask, you can see exactly what's happening here. You can see this part is pretty much unaffected, and then gradually the exposure is getting darker and darker until outside here it's at this minus 0.68. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the mask by pressing O, and I'm going to decrease this just a bit. So I'm going to just hover here, press up on my keyboard arrow, and maybe let's put that to about there. So what happens here is we've gradually darkened the outside of the frame and left his exposure unaffected. And you'll really be able to see it if I turn this on and off. You can see how much of an impact that makes, but it doesn't look really obvious. It's a pretty subtle effect, and it's something that I use quite a bit in my own work. Now, once again, if I wanted to go in here and I didn't like how much it darkened down here, we can use the brush tool. I can erase and turn off auto mask for this one, and I can just click in here. I can erase on him and bring his clothes back up to the normal exposure, so that really the only effect this has is on the background parts of the scene. And now I'm going to go ahead and press O and see I did miss a few places here, so I can go ahead and erase those really quickly. Again, this is just a quick job just to demonstrate the tool here, maybe clean up his hat a little bit. And let's hit O again, and now we can see exactly what this looks like. Now, one other thing you can do, you can also invert the mask. So if we go back to Edit, and we are back here out of the brush, if I click on Invert, then what that does is it darkens just the inside here. And that actually looks really bad because I've erased so much. But you can see it turned off all of this outside area and darkened the inside. I don't want that, I want the outside darkened, so we're gonna leave it like this. I can also adjust the feather if I wanted to make it a little more gradual, or I can make it a lot more severe, which is gonna look really bad, just so you see what that looks like. That is not something that I want. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave it just like that, and I think that looks pretty good. So that's a quick overview of the radial filter tool. Now the last tool we have, and possibly the most powerful editing tool we have at our disposal in Lightroom, is the adjustment brush. So let's just dive in and I'll show you how it works. So if we go over here to the right, we can choose this brush, and there's nothing new here. We are familiar already with all of these different sliders. We have these presets at our disposal, and we have some new information down here that you briefly saw earlier. So I'm gonna go over this. So we have the brush tool out here on the image, and if I go in here, you'll see the brush pop up when I go to adjust the size. So I can drag this and change the size. I can also change this feathering effect, which is the outer circle, and then I can change the flow of the brush as well. The density is one of the other things that will affect how much adjustment goes onto the image, and I'll kind of demonstrate that. And finally, we have auto mask, which I'm not going to use at this point, but you saw how it worked in the previous example, or the graduated filter example. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this guy's face. And what I want to do is first I want to work on his eyes a little, and I'm going to use one of these presets, and there is an iris enhance. So let's see what that does. So I'm going to change the size of this by just click on the bracket keys, make the brush a little smaller, and let's just drag this around in his eye. And you can see it actually changes the color and kind of the look of his eyes. And if I turn this brush on and off, and you can see how much of an effect it has. It's pretty drastic, and I don't really want it to be that severe, so I'm gonna go and change the density of this brush. Now, unfortunately, one of the things about Lightroom is you can't just go and change density and have it affect what you've already applied. So it's kind of nice in some cases if you want to apply different densities with the same brush, but at the same time, it's kind of annoying because what I just did here, I have to completely redo. But there's a few different ways I can do that. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna jump back in here and turn on this overlay, and you can see how bright red this is on his eyes. Well, now that I've changed the density down to 58%, if I go and brush on here, you can see it actually makes it less red. It actually decreases the density on his eyes, and if I turn off the overlay, you can see it's a little more subtle. If I go in here and change the effect, or change back and forth in the history, you can see it did decrease the effect here. Now, one other option would be to just completely delete this and start over, but for just time-saving sake, I'm just gonna brush this on here and call it good. Now, the reason this brush is so powerful is because I can work with very small and defined areas. With the graduated filter, there's no way I could just work on his eyes, and with the radial filter, I could possibly work on just his eyes, but it's not gonna work for a lot of other examples. So let me go ahead and jump into another image and show you how that works. So let's go back to this landscape image here and see what we can do with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and zoom out, and we're gonna choose the brush here. And what I want to do, let's go ahead and maybe darken up these rocks here just a little bit. So what I want to change is the exposure. We're just gonna, actually let's change this so we don't have to adjust a bunch of different things, and just go to burn. And so it's set to -30. I'm just gonna brush this in here really fast, and you can see it's a pretty subtle effect. It's darkening up those rocks, and I'm just gonna go ahead and call that good. So let's quickly see what we've done. And you can see it has made a little bit of a difference. But let's say I don't want to burn on this sunlight section here. So I do have the option to change my brush to an erase brush, which I can do clicking here. Or another quick option, which I use all the time, is to hold down Alt or Option, and that instantly changes my brush into the erase. You can see the brush changes, and then over here it changes as well to erase. So that's a really quick way to switch back and forth. So if I do that, change the brush size, I can erase what I've done on here. And if I look at the overlay, you can see that part is completely missing. We don't have any effect being applied here, and it's just applied to the rest of this. So that's a really, really powerful way again, this brush is very flexible. It lets you do a lot of things in a lot of ways to images, and you can really fine tune an image to your liking. So let's go ahead and just do one or two more brushes. You can do as many as you want on an image, and what I want to do is maybe I do want these mountains to be just a little bit darker. So we already have it set to burn. I'm going to create a new brush by hitting enter. You see this one's no longer has the dot in the middle. So what we're going to do is create a new brush and just brush in on these mountains up here. And I'm just going to do a rough job just for demonstration purposes. And look at the overlay by pressing O. And that you can see is in the sky. It's all over the place. So I can go in here, hold down Alt, and I can erase this and I can make it pretty rough. And again, now some of the mountains are missing. So one of the best ways to do this is to use the auto mask. So let's go ahead and delete this, and I'll show you exactly how cool this auto mask feature is. So with the auto mask, if I brush in here, you can see the red is getting applied to the mountains, but even though I'm touching the sky, well, there a little bit went in, but that's bound to happen sooner or later if you're pretty sloppy about it like I am. And so what I want to do now is zoom in, hold down the Option or the Alt key, increase my brush size, and just kind of erase this area around here. So now we have burned the mountains. Let me turn off this, and we haven't touched the sky or affected it at all. Another thing you can do with the erase function is you can partially erase sections. So let's say I want to brighten this little section in here. So if I hold down, well, let's just go ahead and go change this to erase over here and change the flow to 56. And I decrease the brush size. If I turn on the mask, you'll see this part is going to get lighter, but it's not going to completely disappear. So you can see right now I'm slightly erasing this, and because it's flow, if I keep doing that, eventually it's all going to disappear, so I don't want to do that. But what I've done is I've just gradually erased part of this mask, and when I turn this off, you'll see this is darkened up a little bit compared to here, or it's lightened up a little bit compared to here, and that's simply by changing the flow on the erase brush. So now that I've shown you all of the different tools available here, I want to point out one more thing, and it's going back to these keyboard shortcuts that I use all the time. So if you hover over each one of these tools, it's going to tell you what the tool is, and then in parentheses, what the keyboard shortcut is. So for crop, it's going to be R. For the spot healing, it's going to be Q. For red eye, I never use it, so I don't know. It actually doesn't have a shortcut, so that shows you how much it really gets used. For the graduated filter, it's M. For the radial filter, it's Shift M. And the brush you can access by pressing K. So make sure you take a little bit of time and try and remember some of these shortcuts, because these are tools that you'll use all the time. They're very powerful, and you'll use more than one on any given image. So by using the shortcuts, you can quickly toggle back and forth between them and save yourself a lot of time. If you find yourself using the same settings over and over in any of these given tools, you can create a preset, and we've shown those already in this drop-down menu here, so I'm going to show you how to make your very own. So let's say we want to make a preset. So we can go ahead and keep the exposure here at -0.3. Let's maybe recover some highlights just a little bit, bump up the shadows, increase the whites and blacks, and let's call that good. So if we go up here into this drop-down menu and go all the way to the bottom, we see Save Current Settings as New Preset. So I can name this anything I want. Let's just call it John and create. So now we have this setting that's in here, and it's alphabetically organized, so it's going to fall right in the middle of this bottom section. These are the more customized presets, and we have this John preset. Now the really nice thing here is this not only works in the brush tool, it works in the radial filter tool, it works in the graduated filter tool. So if I wanted to do the John preset to the sky, I can go ahead and do that, and I can also brush in some John right about here if I wanted to. You can still make adjustments to it, and it's going to say it's been edited, and if you like the way that looks better, you can go ahead and create a new preset, or you can update the current preset with the current settings. So that's just one thing that you can do. I personally have a lot of custom presets, and I use them all the time. Once I found settings that worked for me, I created presets, and I find them invaluable and use them almost every single time I edit photos. Okay, so we're pretty much done here. Let's go ahead and go back to the grid, and it is time to talk about the next submodule in the develop module.